The night of June 20th, 1743, began the way most nights did in the waters off Cape Espiritu Santo. Warm, humid, with a moon that came and went behind low clouds rolling west off the Philippine Sea. A single British warship, the HMS Centurion, had been shadowing the Spanish coast for weeks, her sails trimmed low, her gun ports closed, waiting. Her commander, Commodore George Anson of the Royal Navy, had ordered his men into a routine that disguised the warship as something less. The Centurion had been at sea for nearly 4 years. Of the 6 ships and 1,900 men who had sailed with Anson from England in 1740, only the Centurion and around 200 men remained. The rest had been lost to scurvy, storms, wreck, and a Pacific crossing that had killed sailors faster than any naval enemy. What kept Anson alive through all of it was the prospect of a single ship. That ship was the Nuestra Señora de Covadonga, and on the morning of June 20th, her lookout spotted the Centurion exactly where Spanish charts insisted no English vessel could possibly be. The Covadonga was the annual Manila Galleon, sailing east across the Pacific toward Acapulco with a cargo whose value the Spanish crown had been protecting for 178 years. Her captain, Geronimo Montero, was an experienced officer. He saw the Centurion turn toward him, recognized her for what she was, and made the only choice the galleon's design allowed him to make. He cleared his decks for battle and prepared to outlast the Englishmen the way Manila galleons had outlasted every other attacker for nearly 2 centuries. He had cannons, he had Philippine hardwood in his hull that European cannonballs had failed to break 100 times before. He had a crew of 530 men, more than twice Anson's number. What he did not have was speed, and what he did not understand was how thoroughly 4 years of starvation had hardened the men aboard the Centurion into something the Pacific had not seen before. The battle lasted 90 minutes. The Centurion's gunners drilled relentlessly through the long crossing, fired 3 broadsides for every one of Montero's. The Covadonga's massive hull absorbed shot after shot exactly as the ship had been built to do, but the men on her open decks did not. By the time Montero struck his colors, 67 of his crew were dead and 84 wounded. The Centurion had lost 2 men. Inside the Covadonga's holds, Anson's boarding officers counted 1.3 million silver pesos, 35,000 ounces of plate, and bales of Chinese silk whose value would later be calculated separately because there was no one aboard who could appraise it quickly. It was the single largest naval capture in British history to that point. When Anson sailed back to England with it the following year, the silver was paraded through London in 32 wagons. He was made a peer of the realm. The crew received prize shares large enough that ordinary seamen retired on them. What ended that morning off Cape Espiritu Santo was not just one ship. It was the puncture wound in a system that had refused to bleed for 2.5 centuries. An empire had built a single route across the largest ocean on Earth and had grown so confident in that route that it had stopped changing anything about it. The Covadonga's capture wasn't the death of the Manila Galleon. The galleons would sail for another 72 years. But the wound was real, and the empire would not heal it. This is the story of how one ship became the dream of every pirate, privateer, and naval commander in 2 oceans, and how the empire that built her refused to change until the route itself became its punishment. To understand what Anson captured that morning, you have to understand what Andres de Urdaneta had built 178 years earlier. Urdaneta was an Augustinian friar. He had been a soldier and a navigator before he took his vows, and by 1565 he was 67 years old, living quietly in a monastery in Mexico City when King Philip II of Spain personally requested his service for a single voyage. The problem the king wanted solved was geographic and had defeated every European navigator who had tried it. Spanish ships had been sailing from the Americas to the Philippines since Ferdinand Magellan's expedition 40 years earlier. The trade winds carried them west across the Pacific with reasonable reliability. The return trip was the catastrophe. Ship after ship had been lost trying to sail east against those same winds, the survivors limping back to Asian ports half-starved or wrecking on islands no European had named. Spain held the Philippines, Spain held Mexico. Between them lay an ocean that traffic could cross in only one direction. Urdaneta sailed from the port of San Miguel in the Philippines in June of 1565 in a small vessel called the San Pedro. Instead of trying to sail directly east into the prevailing winds, he sailed north almost as far as the latitude of modern Japan, until he caught a current and a wind system that no European had ever charted. The current carried him east across the northern Pacific, past the cold latitudes where his crew suffered terribly, and then south down the coast of California to Acapulco. He arrived on October 8, 1565, after 4 months at sea, having lost 16 of his 44 men. He had found the Tornavii, the return voyage, a route that worked. It worked for a specific and brutal reason. The route was so long, so cold, and so demanding that only an empire with enormous reserves of men and ships could afford to sail it regularly. Once Spain knew the route existed, no other European power could replicate it without first sending an expedition that would, by the time it returned, have given Spain decades of monopoly. And Spain made sure those expeditions failed when they came. For the next 250 years, exactly one ship per year sailed from Manila to Acapulco, sometimes two, never more than necessary. The Manila Galleon was not a trade route in the way the Atlantic was a trade route. It was a single annual voyage scheduled with the precision of a religious festival, carrying cargo whose value was great enough to justify the entire infrastructure of the Spanish Pacific. Ordinata died in 1568, 3 years after his return. He never sailed the route again. The route sailed itself year after year, generation after generation, and the men who walked into the Augustinian monastery in Mexico City to look at the old friars' charts came back understanding that they had inherited a piece of geography that the rest of the world could not touch. The legal economy of the 16th century had no concept of what was about to be built. The illegal economy would need 120 years to learn how to attack it. The galleons themselves were built in the Philippines, in shipyards along the bay south of Manila at a place called Cavite. The Spanish crown had tried building galleons in Mexico in the early years, and the results had been disappointing. Mexican shipyards lacked the right timber, the right craftsmen, and the right location for what the galleons needed to be. Cavite had all three. The forests of the Philippines produced hardwoods that European shipwrights had never worked with: Malave, Lao teak, and a wood the Spanish called guijo, which is now nearly extinct. These were tropical hardwoods grown over decades in volcanic soil, dense enough that a cannonball fired from 100 yards would lodge in the planking without passing through. European warships were built from oak, which was excellent for the cold Atlantic, but which splintered when struck, sending lethal wooden shrapnel through gun decks and across the men working them. Galleon hulls did not splinter. They absorbed the Cavite shipyards, employed thousands of Filipino shipwrights, carpenters, and rope makers, along with conscripted laborers from communities across the archipelago whose names appear in almost no Spanish documents. They worked under Spanish foremen, but the methods they used were their own, combining European hull design with techniques developed across centuries of Southeast Asian boat building. The galleons that came out of Cavite were not Spanish ships in any meaningful technical sense. They were Filipino ships flying Spanish flags. The largest of them displaced 2,000 tons. They carried up to 60 cannons, though they often sailed with fewer mounted. Their crews could exceed 1,000 men, though typical crews were closer to 500. They were slow and difficult to maneuver, which the Spanish considered an acceptable trade for the protection their hulls provided. The cargoes they carried defined them more than their tonnage did. Westbound from Acapulco to Manila, the galleons carried silver. Specifically, they carried Mexican silver pesos minted from ore mined at Potosi in modern Bolivia and Zacatecas in modern Mexico, and refined into coins at the mint in Mexico City. The annual shipment ranged from 1 to 3 million pesos depending on the year. That silver, once it reached Manila, was exchanged for goods that Chinese merchants brought down from Fujian province in junks, anchoring in Manila Bay for the trading season. Eastbound from Manila to Acapulco, the galleons carried what that silver had bought: Chinese silk, both raw and woven, porcelain from Jingdezhen, cinnamon from Ceylon, pepper from the Spice Islands, beeswax from across the archipelago, ivory carved in Manila workshops by Chinese craftsmen who had emigrated from Fujian, religious statuary, also Chinese carved, depicting Catholic saints with faces that were sometimes recognizably Asian, cloves, camphor, cotton textiles from India that had reached Manila through the Portuguese trade out of Goa, gold from across Southeast Asia. When a galleon reached Acapulco, the entire port transformed. The Acapulco Fair, held in the weeks after the ship's arrival, was the largest commercial event in the Americas. Merchants traveled from as far as Lima, Peru, and Quito, Ecuador, to buy. Mule trains carried the silk and porcelain across the mountains to Mexico City, and from there to Veracruz, where it was shipped onward to Seville. By the time a yard of Manila silk reached a customer in Madrid, it had been on the road for 2.5 years. The world the galleon built was the first global economy, the first economy in human history that genuinely connected the 4 major continents in regular, predictable trade. The galleons did not invent any of the goods they carried, but they made those goods available to populations that had never seen them before. They put Chinese porcelain on tables in Buenos Aires. They put Mexican silver into Chinese tax records. They created a circulation of money and goods so vast that scholars have argued the galleon trade was the foundation of the early modern world. And for the first 16 years of that trade, no European power outside Spain seemed to know it existed. The first crack appeared in 1587, and the man who made it was English. Thomas Cavendish was 26 years old and a privateer. He had been part of Sir Richard Grenville's expedition to Virginia 3 years earlier and had come home convinced that the Spanish Empire, despite its reputation, was thinner than its maps suggested. He outfitted 3 small vessels at his own expense, sailed for the Pacific in 1586, and rounded Cape Horn in January of 1587. What Cavendish was doing was something that almost no English captain had attempted. Francis Drake had been the only Englishman to circumnavigate the globe before him, and Drake had done it less than a decade earlier. Cavendish had Drake's logbooks and Drake's understanding that the Pacific coast of Spanish America was nearly undefended. The Pacific was a Spanish lake. There were no Spanish warships patrolling it, because there had been no need for any. Cavendish raided up the coast of Chile and Peru, capturing small Spanish vessels, gathering information, and listening. What he was listening for was the date the annual galleon was expected at Acapulco. He intercepted the Santa Ana off Cabo San Lucas at the southern tip of Baja California on November 4th, 1587. The Santa Ana was the largest galleon of her year, displacing 700 tons, carrying a crew of 200 passengers and sailors, and a cargo manifest, later valued at 122,000 pesos in gold alone. Her holds were full of silk, musk civet, and pearls. She had no cannons mounted. This detail is the one that explains everything about what the galleon trade had become by 1587. The Manila galleons were warships in design, capable of mounting 60 guns. The Santa Ana had sailed with her armament struck down into the holds to save deck space for additional cargo. The Crown had grown so confident in the secrecy of the route, in the impossibility of an attacker reaching that specific stretch of ocean at that specific time of year, that it had effectively disarmed its own treasure ships. Cavendish engaged with 2 small vessels, the Desire and the Content, mounting 18 guns between them. The fight lasted 6 hours and was one-sided. The Santa Ana's crew fought with what they had, which was mostly muskets and personal arms, but they could not return fire against ships standing off and bombarding them. When the Santa Ana surrendered, Cavendish boarded her, transferred as much of the cargo as his small ships could carry, set the remaining passengers ashore at a safe distance, and burned the galleon. He could not bring the ship home. He could only deprive Spain of her. He sailed home across the Pacific, past the Philippines, across the Indian Ocean, and around the Cape of Good Hope, completing the second English circumnavigation of the globe. He arrived in Plymouth on September 9, 1588, only weeks after the defeat of the Spanish Armada in the English Channel. Queen Elizabeth knighted him. The capture of the Santa Ana was celebrated as further proof that Spanish power was an illusion that the right kind of Englishman could dispel. Spain's response is the part of the story that matters most. The Spanish crown investigated the capture. The investigation concluded that the Santa Ana should have been better armed. New regulations were drafted requiring future galleons to sail with their cannons mounted and ready. The route itself was reviewed and confirmed as adequate. The route did not change. The schedule did not change. The shipyards at Cavite continued building galleons to the same specifications they had been using for 20 years. The galleons continued to sail from Manila to Acapulco at the same time each year, following the same path Urdaneta had charted in 1565. Cavendish himself did not enjoy his triumph long. He sailed on a second expedition in 1591, attempting to repeat his success, and died at sea in 1592 of disease or possibly despair after his ships were scattered in storms off the South American coast. He was 29 years old, but he had proved something the Spanish refused to absorb. The Pacific was not an empty ocean. The route was not a secret. The galleons were not invulnerable. The first man to attack the system had won, and the system had responded by writing a memorandum. The next attack would come 122 years later, and the man who led it would later govern Nassau and hunt the pirates who built the Republic out of its harbor. Woodes Rogers sailed from Bristol in August of 1708 in command of 2 privateering vessels, the Duke and the Duchess. He had financial backers in Bristol and a commission from the British Crown authorizing a tax on Spanish shipping during the War of the Spanish Succession. His pilot was William Dampier, the same Dampier who had circumnavigated the globe 3 times and who knew the Pacific better than any Englishman alive. What Rogers wanted was a Manila galleon. He spent the better part of a year working up the Pacific coast of South America, taking small Spanish prizes, repairing his ships at the uninhabited Juan Fernandez Islands off Chile, where he found Alexander Selkirk and brought him home, the story that would later become Robinson Crusoe. By late 1709, Rogers was positioned off the coast of Baja California, waiting for the same galleon Cavendish had taken 122 years earlier in the same stretch of water. 2 galleons were sailing that year, which was unusual. The smaller was the Nuestra Señora de la Encarnación de Desengaño, displacing around 400 tons. The larger was the Begonia, displacing approximately 900 tons and carrying perhaps 60 guns mounted and ready, because Spain had at least learned that much from 1587. Rogers attacked the smaller galleon first on December 22, 1709. The Encarnación fought for several hours and then struck her colors. Rogers had his prize. He could have sailed home then. Instead, he attacked the Begonia. The fight that followed was the engagement Rogers wrote about in his published account, with a mixture of pride and frustration. His ships fired into the Begonia's hull throughout an entire day. The cannonballs lodged in the Philippine hardwood and did not pass through. The Begonia fired back with her heavier guns and damaged the Duke seriously. Rogers was wounded in the face by a musket ball that broke his upper jaw and left him with a permanent disfigurement that he wore for the rest of his life as a kind of testimony. The Begonia did not surrender. By evening, Rogers broke off the engagement and sailed away with only the smaller prize. The Encarnación was taken to Acapulco's harbor approaches, condemned, and her cargo distributed among the investors. Rogers continued west across the Pacific, completed his circumnavigation, and arrived back in England in 1711 with profits substantial enough to satisfy his backers and a published narrative that made him famous. His narrative is the source for much of what we know about the galleons from the attacker's perspective. Rogers wrote with the dry precision of a man who had done business at gunpoint and seen what worked and what didn't. He described the galleon hulls in detail, the way the wood absorbed his fire, the way the larger ship had been almost impossible to damage decisively. He concluded, in essence, that the galleons could be hurt, but not stopped without resources greater than any single privateering expedition could bring. Spain again did not change the route. The Begonia had survived. The system had worked in Spanish eyes exactly as designed. A galleon had been lost, but the larger of the 2 galleons had successfully defended itself and continued to Manila. The conclusion in Madrid was that the system was functioning. The conclusion in London was different. London understood after Rogers that a properly resourced naval expedition could do what privateers could not. The route was now known. The schedule was now known. The defenses were now understood. Spain had refused to evolve, and the rest of the world was preparing to take advantage of that refusal. It would take another 34 years, but the next attack would not be a privateer in a converted merchantman. It would be a Royal Navy captain in a ship of the line sent with the authority of the British Crown. The decision to send George Anson into the Pacific was made in 1739 at the outbreak of the War of Jenkins' Ear. The British Admiralty wanted to apply pressure to Spanish trade across multiple oceans. Anson's expedition was one component of a larger strategic effort that included Caribbean operations and harassment of Spanish shipping in the Atlantic. The Pacific component was meant to be a serious attempt at capturing or burning the Manila galleon. What followed was one of the costliest naval expeditions in British history relative to results until the results arrived. Anson sailed from Portsmouth on September 18, 1740, with 6 ships and approximately 1,900 men. The crossing of the Atlantic was uneventful. The rounding of Cape Horn nearly destroyed him. The squadron encountered storms so severe that ships were dismasted, men were swept overboard, and scurvy began to take the survivors. By the time the remnants of the squadron reached the Juan Fernandez Islands, more than half the men were dead. Anson worked up the South American coast slowly, raiding what he could, repairing his remaining ships, and gathering information about the galleon schedule. By 1742, only the Centurion was still fit for sea. The rest of the squadron had been wrecked, abandoned, or sent home with the dying. Anson had about 200 men left and a single warship. He crossed the Pacific to Macau in 1742 to refit. He let it be known deliberately that he was sailing home around the Cape of Good Hope and abandoning the Pacific operation. Spanish intelligence in Macau picked up the rumor and reported it to Manila. The galleon sailing east from Manila in 1743 was therefore not particularly worried. Anson did not sail home. He sailed back into the Philippines and waited off Cape Espiritu Santo for the galleon he had been hunting for almost 4 years. The capture of the Nuestra Senora de Covadonga on June 20th, 1743 was the moment everything Cavendish had proved and Rogers had confirmed became official. A British warship had captured a Manila galleon in Spanish home waters, taken its cargo, and sailed away with it. The defenses Spain had relied on for 178 years had failed against a single ship operated by a starving crew. When Anson reached London in June of 1744, the silver was paraded through the streets in 32 wagons covered with Union flags. He was made First Lord of the Admiralty within 7 years. His published account of the voyage became one of the most widely read travel narratives of the 18th century. The phrase Manila Galleon entered the English language as a synonym for an unimaginable prize. In Madrid, the response was the same response that had followed Cavendish and Rogers. The route was reviewed, the defenses were tightened, the schedule did not change. New regulations were issued. Filipino shipwrights at Cavite continued building galleons to the same specifications. The next galleon sailed on schedule for another 72 years. The galleons continued to sail. They sailed smaller and slower and poorer. The silver shipments declined. The Mexican mines were producing less. Chinese demand for silver, which had absorbed Spanish silver for 2 centuries, was beginning to shift. The British East India Company was now operating across the Pacific with ships that could reach Canton directly. The galleon trade's monopoly on Asian luxuries in the Americas was being undercut from multiple directions, none of which Madrid acknowledged. The Mexican War of Independence began in 1810. The colonial administration in New Spain found itself fighting an internal war that consumed resources the galleon trade had once consumed. The annual fare at Acapulco shrank year by year as the war made travel from Mexico City difficult. The last Manila galleon was the Magallanes. She sailed from Acapulco on her westbound voyage in 1815 and reached Manila later that year. The royal decree formally closing the galleon trade was issued on April 23, 1815 by King Ferdinand VII, who had returned to the Spanish throne after the Napoleonic Wars and who was attempting to rationalize what remained of the empire. There was no ceremony, there was no announcement in Acapulco. The annual fair that year simply did not happen, and no one in the official record seems to have noted that an event 250 years old had ended. The shipyards at Cavite went quiet. The Filipino shipwrights who had built every Manila galleon for 10 generations found other work or did not. Their names had never appeared in Spanish records in any case. The hardwoods they had used were now valuable enough that European shipbuilders began importing Philippine timber for their own vessels, which is one of the reasons certain Philippine forests no longer exist. Historians mark 1815 as the end of the Manila galleon trade. That date corresponds to the royal decree, which corresponded to nothing in particular except the bureaucratic acknowledgement of a system that had already collapsed under its own weight. But the question we're sitting with isn't when it ended. The question is what it actually was and what its end actually meant. The galleon was not a ship in the way other ships were ships. It was a piece of infrastructure that an empire had committed itself to maintaining for 2.5 centuries without significant modification. The men who designed it in the 1560s would have recognized the ships built in the 1810s as essentially the same vessels they had launched, with the same hull design, the same crew structure, the same route, the same schedule, the same defenses, and the same vulnerabilities. This was not stupidity on Spain's part. It was something stranger and harder to name. The galleon had worked so well for so long that it had become identical in the official imagination with the Spanish presence in the Pacific itself. To change the galleon would be to admit that the system had needed changing, and the system had been generating extraordinary wealth for the crown across 2 centuries. Why change what worked? The answer that history provides retrospectively is that nothing works forever, and that the systems most resistant to change are usually the systems that have worked longest. The galleon was so successful that Spain stopped thinking about it. And when Cavendish proved in 1587 that the galleon could be taken, and Rogers proved in 1709 that it could be taken again, and Anson proved in 1743 that it could be taken by a starving crew on a single ship, Spain's response each time was the same. The system was fundamentally sound. The losses were exceptional. The route would continue. The men and women who actually built the galleons were never consulted. The Filipino shipwrights at Cavite are nearly anonymous in the historical record. The Chinese craftsmen in Manila, who carved the religious statuary that filled the galleon holds are anonymous. The conscripted Filipino sailors who crewed the eastbound voyages who died at rates that European sailors would have found intolerable are anonymous. They appear in Spanish records as numbers, as wages paid or unpaid, as casualty totals after particularly bad voyages. Their voices do not survive. What survives is the outline. 2.5 centuries of a single ship sailing east across the Pacific year after year, carrying a cargo that connected China to the Americas to Europe in a circulation of silver and silk that defined the early modern global economy, the Filipino hardwoods that absorbed cannonballs, the fairs at Acapulco where merchants from Lima haggled over porcelain made in Jing, the dream that obsessed pirates and privateers for 2 centuries until the dream finally cost the empire that had built it. The empire did not lose the galleon to its enemies. The empire lost the galleon by refusing to change it. When the Magellans completed her final voyage in 1815 and the shipyards at Cavite went quiet, what ended was not a trade route. What ended was the longest-running act of imperial inertia in the early modern world. The galleon had been a marvel. It had also been a target painted on the ocean for 250 years, and the marvel and the target had been the same object. Somewhere in the records of the Acapulco Customs House, in the years immediately after 1815, there are entries showing the gradual decline of imported Asian goods, the redirection of trade to other routes, the slow disappearance of a commercial culture that had defined the city for 10 generations. Then the entries stop. The Customs House was reorganized under the new Mexican Republic, and its records of the Galleon era pass into archives where they have largely remained. The sea remembers nothing. But the archives preserve what the sea forgot, and somewhere in those manifests and depositions and customs entries, there are the names of ships that arrived on schedule for 250 years carrying cargoes that changed the world, and the names of the men who fought to take them, and the empty silence where the names of the men and women who built them should have been. The empires that survived the 18th century were the ones that learned to change. The British learned from the loss of the Santa Ana in 1587 and the partial defeat of the Begonia in 1709 and adapted their naval strategy across the Pacific for a century and a half until Anson took the Covadonga. The Spanish learned that the route still worked and continued to send galleons that grew slower and poorer and less defended until the route closed itself. The galleon was the mighty floating stronghold that pirates dreamed of capturing. It was also the slow trap that Spain set for itself in the middle of the largest ocean on Earth. Both things were true at once, and the contradiction took 2.5 centuries to resolve. When the last galleon sailed and the shipyards at Cavite fell silent, an experiment in unchanging power had ended. The dream survived in pirate ballads and in the captured silver still circulating through European banks. The reality faded into the quiet of an empty Mexican fairground in 1815 where no one came to buy silk, because there was no silk to sell, because the ship that had carried it for 10 generations had simply finally stopped sailing. The empires won. They always win eventually, but the empires that won were not the empires that built the prize. They were the empires that learned faster. And the galleon, after 250 years of being the most coveted object on the world's oceans, became history.